on them, since externalities reduce economic efficiency and in many cases
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be moderating this parallel session. I'm just going to give just 1 more minute for everyone to join us because I see that we are still missing some panelists. So let's just wait 1 more minute, please. Okay, well, let's start then. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this parallel thematic session where we will address the topic of the conference from the perspective of law, democracy, and institution, and that I have the privilege to chair. So first of all, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Jean-François Furnemont, and I'm the founder and CEO of Wagner Hatfield, which is a research and consulting company offering various services related to policy, regulation, strategy in the media and in the digital economy sectors. And some of you also know me from my former professional experience as Director General of the Belgian CSA and also Chairman of EPRA, the European Platform of Media Regulatory Authorities. Let me also give you some instructions for a smooth organization of the panel. I would like to ask the audience and the panelists to mute your microphone and to open it only when it is your turn to speak. And regarding the questions that the audience might have for the panelists, we will have half an hour for that after the intervention of our 5 panelists. And you will have the choice either to do it live during the question time or to send questions to the speakers via the chat, which will be collected by the conference staff and referred to me at the end of the presentations. Let me thank the audience for having chosen this session. We will try with the panelists, of course, to make sure that you don't regret this choice. And let me briefly introduce them in the order in which they will intervene. First intervention will be from Professor Antonio Nichita, I'm sorry, I don't know, Professor of Economic Policy at LUMSA University in Rome. Hello, Antonio.
Hi. Hello, can you hear me?
All good, thank you. Then we will have Professor Beatrice Rabai, Assistant Professor at University of Pavia. Welcome, Beatrice. Are you also online?
I think she's trying to enter, but she was there.
Okay, well, can I ask to the technical staff maybe to see if Beatrice needs some help while I continue presenting the other panelists? I think it's Melanie who is in charge of that, right?
Thank you. We'll look now, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. The third academic to join us will be Professor Ben Wagner, Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management at University of Delft, and Professor of Media, Technology and Society in Holland University of Applied Science. Hello, Ben.
Hello, it's lovely to see you.
Well, okay, it works. Nice to meet you too. I heard a lot about you, and especially from my former EPRA colleagues about the outstanding keynotes that you delivered at their meeting in Vienna a few years ago. So I'm really glad to join you today.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
We will then move on to a regulatory perspective with Dr. Sayed Emamian, who is the president of the Iranian Media Regulatory Authority and also founding partner of GPTT, the Governance and Policy Think Tank. I'm glad to see you again, Sayed.
Hi, John. Thank you very much. I'm very much happy to see you again.
Yeah, okay, all good. And then we will end the roundtable with a market perspective with Johan Ketelaar, who is Director of Public Policy and Head of Connectivity and Access EMEA at Facebook. Welcome, Johan.
Thank you, Jean-Francois, and nice meeting you all.
Well, all good. So I think we can start. I hope the issue with Beatrice will be solved by the time Antonio has made in his presentation. So Antonio, please proceed.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my. Can you see it?
And I see that Beatrice has joined us, so it's all good now. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes.
So I will be very fast because we have.
Just a minute, Antonio.
Yes.
Beatrice, could you shut up your micro, please?
Sorry?
Could you shut up your micro, please?
Switch off the microphone.
While
please.
Antonio is speaking. Voila, thank you very much. Go ahead, Antonio.
Yes,
Go ahead.
so I will go very fast. The topic on which I will focus is on this idea that I think it's very important to be introduced in this debate, which is the right not to be disinformed. Let me explain what is the main point. The argument is this one. Many of the ideas of the traditional pluralism regulation that we have investigated in the past that actually have shaped all the pluralism rules in many developed countries are based on the idea of the marketplace of ideas, which comes from John Stuart Mill and also from Judge Oliver Holmes. And it's based on a specific idea of free speech and its relation with truth. as an economic and social good. My point is that in the actual digital sphere, in the sense of Habermas, as has been said before, this marketplace of ideas could somehow be transformed in a marketplace of truth. And what this implies for our democracy is an important issue to be investigated. Then what is the relationship between free speech and truth in the public digital sphere? And what are the market failures we need to fix in order to shape and design a new regulation in this respect? So this is my main argument, and I will go very fast now. Let's start from the end, which is the issues in where we are now. We come from some code of practice of disinformation. For instance, the Italian authority has been introduced its own code just 1 year before the European Commission. And this is what we have learned so far. So we have in Europe experienced this code of practice of disinformation, which actually is a form of self-regulation by digital platforms that apply their own rules with different outcomes. One interesting debate has been raised in the US when Donald Trump has proposed his executive order on revoking Section 230, that, as you know, is the section that actually defined the rules for which digital platforms are free to apply and define their own rules for moderation of the digital platforms. And this debate and this executive order has been later cancelled by President Biden. However, the debate is still there, and some of these issues are already in the proposal of the Digital Services Act of the European Union. One point that we need to raise is when we talk about self-regulation, we have some weekly grounds that especially has been raised by several lawyers and legal scholars and law scholars, which is the following. First of all, we have some paradox on let me put this here. We have some paradox on Section 230 and on the idea of neutrality, because on the one side we have a notion of Good Samaritan for which platforms could decide their own rules, but on the other, there is this idea of neutrality in terms of free speech and access, which of course is contradictory. Then we need to define the free speech principle for whom and by whom in this context. Is the free speech of the individual or is the free speech of the platform? And today, these two issues stay together, and maybe we need to articulate in a more detailed way what this means. Third, what is the relationship between free speech and factual truth? The definition of the relationship between truth and free speech comes back to John Stuart Mill. And actually, this is a very important issue because John Stuart Mill clarified that free speech is a value for society, and we should add for democratic society, because it allows a sort of market for truth. Confrontation of opinion will lead a society to be better off because the truth will prevail. So here there is an important legacy because free speech is a function, is an instrument, is a tool to reach the fundamental good of the society, which is truth. So freedom of speech in this original formulation is not an objective per se, but is an instrument to reach truth as a social good. And interestingly, after 1 century, this has been the center of the new doctrine of the marketplace of ideas, which was introduced in 1919 by Oliver Holmes, who was a Supreme Court judge, and actually last almost over a century in the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And the idea is precisely the same. The free speech that is protected as a negative liberty in the First Amendment is interpreted as one way for society to reach truth through free speech. So again, free speech should be protected because it allows society in the marketplace of ideas to reach truth as an economic good. Now, when this happens, this has also shaped the way in which pluralism has been designed in the United States, and I have to say also in many developed countries. In particular, in the United States, we had this fairness doctrine, which was introduced by the FCC in the 40s. And it was actually based on the idea of internal pluralism, which was based on the idea that competition among ideas should be guaranteed in every occasion. So in every transmission, in every broadcasters, each time there was an idea exposed, there should be also competition with that idea. In Italy, this was defined by the Constitutional Court as internal pluralism, but the idea was we should grant competition among ideas, but each time, in each occasion, we need people to discuss and to confront, which was a completely opposite idea of another doctrine which evolved in the Reagan years, which was based on the idea that competition should apply in the market and not within a single transmission, not within a single broadcasting transmission. That means it is the market. It is the market, the possibility of having different sources of information that the listener has to choose that guaranteed the marketplace of ideas. So there was a shift under the 80s between an idea of fairness doctrine for which truth should be granted and competition should be granted in the single occasion in which there was a transmission in TV or in the radio, to the idea that competition should be granted in the market. And so in a sense, this was a shift in the pluralism regulation for which what the regulator has to grant is that competition among different sources is there, not that each source should have competitive ideas when broadcasting. And in Italy, just for the Italian people, this was the idea of shifting from an idea of internal pluralism to an idea of external pluralism. So the idea was that the marketplace of idea will be granted through antitrust rules. So through rules that guarantees on the supply side the existence of many competing sources. Now, very recently, many economists, and especially behavioral economists, has raised this issue. Is supply-side pluralism enough to grant a well-functioning marketplace of ideas? Yes or no? The answers, unfortunately, is no. Supply-side pluralism, which means the existence of many alternative sources over which the consumers has to choose, is not enough to grant pluralism, is not enough to grant the emergence of factual truth. Why? Because we have several biases on the demand side, because we have several cognitive biases like echo chambers, polarizations, emotions, etc., such that when we use free speech in the marketplace of ideas, we actually have not people confronting each other as John Mill was intending, but we have people creating their own tributes, their own different groups that are very polarized and they are not anymore talking to each other. So this means moving, and this is my point, from a marketplace of ideas to a marketplace of truths in which there is not anymore an exchange of ideas. And this goes beyond the post-truth debate because the fundamental misunderstanding here is on the role of free speech in generating truth in the marketplace of ideas, which is the opposite. Free speech may generate a marketplace of truth, which is the opposite of John Stuart Mill ideas. Somehow this leads us to the Popper's idea. You know that Popper was saying that for truth to emerge in a society, the logic of science should allow truth and false events to be confronted with and to be falsified. So the idea was we should not look for ideas that confirm our theories, but we should look for theories that falsify our ideas, because this is the way in which scientific truth do emerge. In a sense, the original idea of Mill was very similar to that of Karl Popper, but this idea works when we have not echo chambers, when we have not cognitive biases, when we have not emotions guiding our search for truth. Kahneman is another important economist, another Nobel Prize that has stressed how confirmation bias, echo chambers, and cognitive bias can completely change and shape our even desire to look for the truth. And he explained how media can even exacerbate distortions, emotions, and cognitive biases. On a similar way, Kassasin has recently shown how the way in which many web designs works is precisely to create a market for truth. I mean, to create single groups confirming, being polarized, and be divided. And these may, according to Kassasin, this may really exacerbate the ability of democracies, as we have just heard previously, to reach not only the truth, but to reach a consensus which is shaped and which is shared by all individuals. If we look at some of the examples, here we have some results of an investigation made by Agicom in 2018, based on a sample of Facebook in Italy. We can see how polarization in many debates was extremely, a living event. Here you see how people grouped in scientific and conspirationists on the one side are extremely polarized. So polarization is a reciprocal phenomenon. And you can see that we have here likes and comments on this sample of Facebook, and how each node is just talking to people belonging to the same node or to the same group, or to people just sharing the same ideas. So polarization and self-confirmation bias is something that is really there in our digital public sphere, but this is something that has also some political consequences. If we just look at the Pew researches on how to measure the median voter in the US, you can see how the median voter is eventually dead, because we observe an extreme polarization. And I want to stress that this phenomenon is coming from 1994, and it has been exacerbated by Donald Trump, but it's not something that just has been happened in 2016. Is a huge phenomenon coming from a long tradition of polarization. And you can also see here how the number of legislation proposals in the US Congress has been signed in all this period by only Democrats or by only Republicans. You can see in the first graph how in 1989, many proposals were really bipartisan, because each of the node here is a member of the parliament, and the node is how many proposals have been signed together between Republicans and Democrats. You can see that in 2013, these nodes are completely polarized. So not only we have polarization in our digital debates, but also we have a political consequences that we can observe. Turning back to Italy, the Agicom has tried to measure this information in the political election at the national level in 2018. And actually what they measured was precisely an increase in the political disinformation just in the weeks before the political election, which means that almost 11% of the information were completely false. But at the same time, there were the information that shaped the public debate just the days and just the weeks before the date of the election. And here you can see what all we ask knows and what has been already quoted before, what happened just in the US, the 6th of January of 2021, on the issues of fraud, of election fraud stated by Donald Trump. By the way, just a few days ago, the Pew Research has published a report according to which the majority of Republican voters still believe that the election was stolen. And we have a huge literature showing that when the majority of people do not trust in the results of the election, the mistrust against the institution is very high, and the risk of destabilization is also very high. Again, Agicom has measured this information also in the case of the COVID. These are data regarding the 2020 evolution, and you can see how disinformation has spread very deeply just after a few weeks from the beginning of the pandemic. And we know that, after all, also the World Health Organization has stressed how the infodemic, the disinformation was very strong. That said, of course, we know that in a world in which everyone can publish, it's very hard to know what to believe, but the issues are the following. Can we just say that just counter speech is enough to deter disinformation? So that we have nothing to do, just grant free speech and counter speech on every issue? Or there is a misunderstanding on the legacy of the marketplace of idea in the digital public sphere, which means, are we sure that just defending the marketplace of ideas in a world of disinformation is really granting the original idea that society will reach the truth, or at least the factual truth? And self-regulation can really tackle the issue. We know that several platforms have started having different kind of self-regulation, and Facebook is even promoting a Supreme Court. But again, this is something that could be appreciated as a self-regulation activity, but there is the risk of creating new formulas, new legal concepts, without having a jurisdiction behind. And this may also raise further problems. So the point, in my view, is to going back to Hannah Arendt. She said at the end of the 60s, a very important point, that freedom of opinion, we can say free speech, is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed and facts themselves are not in dispute. This is very important because we have to take a strong distinction between facts and truth and freedom of expression, because one thing is opinion, quite another thing is defending facts. And so we can have a sort of a free speech dilemma here. Why for John Stuart Mill, once we have free speech, we can reach the truth. For Hannah Arendt, once we have factual truth, we can have free speech. So how can we solve this dilemma between free speech and truth? In my idea, what we need to do is to go for the regulation that has been announced at the European level, but we need to be clear on a point. So we have to define a new right, which is the right for each of us not to be disinformed in the digital arena. What this means? This means first starting to interpret the disinformation as a negative externality, which means as something that is creating negative effects to people that is willing to be informed, but has to sustain extra cost to select the right information. This has to do with overload, but has to do with a strategy of disinformation that targets single individuals and increase the cost for single individuals to select their own information or to select right information. This means put the listener at the center. So interpreting free speech also as a free reach on the demand side, which means I want as a user that it's possible for me to choose the level of profiling to which I could be exposed based on the big data and on my profiling. This means having transparency on algorithms and profiling choices, but also targeting super spreaders of disinformation. The right not to be disinformed should be a negative liberty that is completely different from the traditional right to inform and right to be informed, because once you have no pollution produced by disinformation, you can exert your free speech. So the right not to be disinformed actually is an empowering tool for free speech. And finally, I conclude with some advertising of my books, one in English, one in Italian. We need to introduce, in my view, this idea of a right not to be disinformed as a fundamental value for all the European approach that is based on these 4 pillars, because otherwise we will raise every time the issue of how to preserve free speech and how to balance free speech against falsehood and disinformation. If we introduce the right not to be disinformed as a negative liberty from a legal point of view, then in my view, it's possible to find a balanced approach, which is preserving free speech through preserving and protecting the right not to be disinformed. And I will conclude here. Thank you. I have done.
Voila. Yeah, thank you very much, Antonio. My micro was still closed. Well, this is an interesting start. I have to confess that it seems to me that in a conference which is considering platform benefits and protection needs, we have started by talking a lot about protection needs with you, Antonio. And I think that it makes a good link with the next presentation, which will try to focus on the advantage of platforms in terms of social inclusion. So I will immediately give you the floor, Beatrice.
Thank you so much. In my speech, I explore the role of social actors in technology adoption and the so-called positive side effect on social inclusion in the global village. The coronavirus pandemic and the social distancing measures, self-quarantines and business closures have caused a multi-layered crisis in societies across the world. So many individuals have experienced disruption in social, occupational, and daily life activities. At the same time, the need for social distancing to reduce the spread of the pandemic have accelerated the implementation process of the fourth industrial revolution, which relies on cloud computing, artificial intelligence, big data, 5G network, and more. All tools useful to support the public health as well as to provide the quick solution to governments, organizations, and people during the time of a crisis. In this context, platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and Google have rapidly become crucial communication devices for information creation, dissemination, and consumption, leading to an increasing use of the internet for daily activities and social interaction. But not all people have been able to gain benefit from it. So the isolation has accentuated the gaps that remain in technology, regulation, and digital skills, the so-called digital divide, and has put the spotlight on inequalities and vulnerabilities in the population. So the pandemic has renewed public attention on the issue of ECT accessibility, with particular reference to the social categories which appear to be more at risk of social exclusion than the rest of the population, such as people with disabilities. So, or with vulnerability. Vulnerability has become an important paradigm in our time, but is not a simple concept. So the notion is in common use, is often characterized by plurality of meanings. The vulnerability notion seems to most prominently have emerged in the field of political theory, philosophy, and technology, but recently increasing interest in the areas of ethics and law. In the context of the legal discourse, in particular, according to Feynman, vulnerability is an ontological condition of mankind, a universal, inevitable, enduring aspect of the human condition that must be at the heart of our concept of social and state responsibility. Setting out an alternative to the liberal theory, which imagine an ideal citizen, autonomous, independent, who inhabit a world defined by individual, where state intervention is perceived as a violation of his liberty, because vulnerability and dependency are confined to the private sphere. So the vulnerable subject models gives priority to the value of equality, conceptualize vulnerability as a universal ontological experience for all human beings by virtue of our nature as social beings. In particular, the central thesis of vulnerability theory is that everyone is vulnerable. Also, some people are more resilient than others, and the state therefore has a corresponding obligation to reduce and compensate for that vulnerability. So the theory of Feynman is based on an analysis of American legislation, but it may be helpful for understanding some of the problems with the European welfare system. So people with a disability are often prevented from taking fully part into the society and economy due to environmental and attitudinal barriers. But for a long time, disability has been described differently in scientific literature. On the one hand, the first one described disability as an individual illness or impairment in a person's body. So this approach is based on a belief that the difficulties associated with the disability lies in the individual. So the medical model view disability as an obstacle stemming from the functional limitation of the disabled person, rather than as a societal problem arising from disabling and discriminatory barriers. The social model, on the other hand, describes disability as being socially constructed, a condition attributed to the socio-economic and political disadvantage which limit one's ability to function effectively in society. So, the basic idea of the social model is that the disability should not be considered as an individual problem, but as a matter of life in society, which transfers the responsibility for the disadvantages of a person's bodily limitation to the incapacity of society to predict and adjust in order to diversities. So the social model underpins the entire United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability, which has been hailed as a milestone in the pursuit of the promotion and the protection of disabled person rights. But the aim of the European National Convention is to ensure the protection and promotion of the rights of persons with disability on a basis with others, through the creation of a legislative framework with concrete, enforceable, and time-bound benchmark to monitoring the gradual implementation of accessibility. But should be considered that the focus on the social model of disability in European Union law was impossible for a long time due to lack of European Union competencies in the sphere of social policies that prevented the active influence on the situation of people with disabilities. So the origin of today's European Union policy is to be found in the 1996 communication, a new European Community Disability Strategy, in which the Commission proposed a paradigm shift from its previous medical model approach to disability to a social model based on right. So, post-Amsterdam, the European Union has adopted, among others, the European Disability Strategy 2020, which has attempted to mainstream disability in all European Union policy fields, trying to ensure that people with disability can enjoy their full rights on an equal basis with others and benefit fully for participating in society and the European economy, notably through the single market. So, the diffusion of information communication technology and the use of Internet's World Wide Web have changed the way in which we all participate socially, politically, and culturally within a global network of dispersed communities. And this is the first positive side. But the rapid development of information technology has transformed globalization process, making the world a global village, contributing to quality of life and social connectedness. However, technologies can also increase social inequalities and exclusion among people with disability, which need to have appropriate assistive technologies that can make the content accessible to their carers. Even so, assistive technologies do not in themselves suffice to reduce all barriers. They can centrally become a means for people with disabilities to retain choice and autonomy in their lives. So, the crisis is having a profound impact on the importance of digital inclusion for all people in order to have equal access to the internet in the information and communication technology society. However, the European Union media sector is still far to meet the European nation requirement set by Article 30 and 21 on the Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, that recommend the full participation in cultural life, recreation, and leisure for persons with disability, should enjoy access to cultural materials, television programs, films, theater, and other inaccessible formats through the internet. So, the European Union has taken positive steps towards digital accessibility. So, for the purpose of comply with this new legislation, not only public sector organizations, but also private companies and organizations will need to monitor the accessibility of their website, mobile app, and media content, and to make information from the monitoring available in an accessibility statement in order to render digital content usable and comprehensible by all citizens. Added to these numerous governance initiatives that have relevance in the field of new technologies and people with disabilities, starting with the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030, with particular regard to the explicit disability references. But recently, the European Parliament...
Beatrice, are you going close to an end?
Yeah?
Yeah, we're getting sharp in time. Thanks.
Okay. The European Parliament, in a resolution, underlines serious challenges and right violation experienced by persons with a disability. So, the digital technologies, and in particular assistive technologies, can become a driving force for the inclusion of persons with disabilities, but are far from available to all, as the COVID situation has highlighted. So, it is important to view such accessibility as beneficial for everyone and not just to a small group of people. So, digitalization could produce both catastrophic or beneficial effect in society, and disaster or the failure depends toward a society even more marked by solidarity, inclusion, and respectful on the right and innate values of each individual. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And indeed, it was interesting that you highlighted some issues which are sometimes, unfortunately, not at the top of the policy and regulatory agenda. I think our two first speakers have shown that indeed there are some benefits in the current trends. And as a former chairman of EPRA, I think that there is another benefit of all the policy movements which are going on currently, which is that regulators understand more and more the need to enhance their cooperation. And this is the topic that now Begwander is going to tell us a few words about. So Ben, please go ahead. Ben,
Thank you very much. Yes,
yes,
I'm still
okay,
here.
great.
Let me just share my screen 1 second, and then we will start.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, can you see my slides?
Yes, it's all good. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then just let me turn on the camera as well. So, thank you very much for a kind introduction.
And please keep it to the 10, 12 minutes.
Of course.
Thank
I will
you very
keep it
much.
short and sweet.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben.
Of course. So thanks very much for the kind introduction. My name is Ben Wagner and I'm with TU Delft and in Holland. For those of you who aren't familiar, my work sits between computer science and social science. And it's quite an interesting time to be doing this kind of work, given that we're seeing quite rapidly the effects that platforms have on society. As you've already heard from the two previous speakers, there are numerous challenges with this that have considerable effects on democracy. And as a result of that, we really need to rethink how we think about and how we imagine the role of technology in society, and in particular, the role of large online platforms. So I'll be talking today a little bit about the Digital Services Act specifically, because I believe that this is the central regulatory framework that is being finally voted on today and in the next few days, of which we need to think about in terms of online platforms. And this is the central regulatory framework at a global level, but I feel that it often gets misunderstood. So a brief primer, if you will, to the Digital Services Act, and then a few thoughts on how we can move forward based on it. So when the Digital Services Act is submitted by the European Commission, they say it as a safe, accountable online environment. That's what the Digital Services Act is trying to achieve. Better protection for consumers and their fundamental rights, a powerful framework, as they claim, for clear accountability of online platforms. And then also, we will think about fostering online growth, competitiveness, and innovation within the single market. So the bolding is mine, but I think what you can see quite clearly is that the focus of the Digital Services Act is not so much on ensuring better competition or better markets, but instead on making sure that we have a better protection of consumers and greater transparency. So in this, the Digital Services Act is very similar to the GDPR. And if anything, it could be considered as the GDPR for online speech. So when we look at the Digital Services Act, there are a few key questions. I'm going to go into a few of them now, but I think the main questions that you should always keep in mind when people are discussing, debating, or finalizing the DSA now. And I think that they are sort of central to how we think about and how we understand what the Digital Services Act is and could be. So should platforms be trusted actors in the context of the Digital Services Act? And this is not when we're talking about trusted flaggers or things that the platforms have on their own platforms, but rather should the regulators trust the platforms to provide them with correct information? And based on my own research and the research of numerous colleagues, I think the answer to that is no. Do we have an iterative approach to the way in which they provide information to regulators, such as data transparency categories, or do we need to have these categories defined in advance? How much sensitive data do algorithms, do regulators and auditors need? And my short answer to that would be not much. Is there additional specialist personnel capacity needed? Yes, definitely. How can we ensure effective compliance? That's something that will be discussed in the following slides. And will we get a more federated or more centralized structure for the DSA regulator? This is pretty clear now that we will be getting a more centralized structure. Do we have effective mechanisms right now for platform transparency and other things that the platforms share with us? I don't think we do. And finally, the big one, in the elephant in the room, so to say, how to deal with the legal content. So not the illegal content, that's an easy thing to look at, but rather the legal content that is moderated by online platforms. And I think if we take these questions and provide some simple answers to them, it's not that they are perfect and easy to answer or that they are straightforward, but rather that there are answers for them if you look at the established literature. And I'll specifically be focusing on the two questions in red that you can find here. So the specialist personnel capacity and more federated or more centralized DSA regulatory structure. So the first question with all of this, of course, when we're building new online environments and regulators for them, is who governs? And here, if we look at who governs cybersecurity, a related domain, you find that in many digital areas, the governance is extremely distributed, quite widely. And this is interesting for the Digital Services Act, because the Digital Services Act proposes to create national centralized coordinators. Basically, in doing so, it will distribute across many different agencies and across many different agendas the national competence for responding to requests and issues under the DSA. And the challenge is that if we take this model, it's relatively similar to cybersecurity. You can see that there are a wide variety of different agencies responsible for their ENISA coordinating function on the management board to the different European agencies. So it's not the management board, it's the advisory board of ENISA. And so this shows quite evidently the diversity of the institutionalization of cybersecurity. And I think you could also argue the diversity of the institutionalization of relevant competent authorities for the Digital Services Act. So that's just to say, if we go along with a model that integrates regulators as individual regulators from the perspective of their existing national institutionalizations, we will get a very mixed bag of who is responsible for what under the DSA. And so what we've proposed, but what was in the end not integrated in the same way as in the DSA as we'd hoped, is to have a greater integration of a wide variety of individual national regulators. So not just to be talking about media regulators, not just to be talking about competition authorities, and not just to be talking about data protection authorities, but to involve all of those national regulators in a systematic way and integrate those regulators into the wider understanding of what it means to be doing the DSA and what it means to be enforcing the DSA. We think that this would be a beneficial approach that would be highly valuable in the context of how things are being developed. And this is still possible in the current DSA framework, although it should be acknowledged that most of the power, especially over the so-called very large online platforms, the VLOPs, is now with the central structure of the DSA in the DSA's regulator, which is under the control of the European Commission. Despite that, I think it's important for the DSA to be effective, to ensure that a wide variety of competent national authority regulators are involved, and that it is not just reduced at a national level to a single national regulator. Now, the other issue that is quite challenging in the DSA is specialist personnel capacity. Both at an EU and at a national level, we see that there's a limited ability of individuals to be able to respond to this challenge. And so I think it's extremely important to ensure that the individual actors and the individual agencies who are involved potentially in DSA governance don't just have access to this specialist personnel capacity, but that we develop a pool at a European level which individual regulators at national level, whether they are media, data protection, or other regulators, can benefit from. So this policy specialist personnel capacity doesn't just have to happen with the DSA. It can also be used in the context of Council of Europe or outside the EU's area. And so we're ensuring that regulation and the DSA, the DMA, or even the AI Act happens based on an actual meaningful capacity to be able to regulate and to be able to respond to these challenges. So when we're thinking about the DSA and when we're thinking about now the implementation that will be coming over the next months and years, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge that it's not just about thinking through how we involve different actors and make sure that their content is really being regulated, but that we really think about regulatory capacities, which agencies are involved, and which actors are most able to ensure that many of the challenges we see with online digital platforms are meaningfully regulated. So in conclusion, the DSA is definitely an innovative piece of legislation that copies the GDPR's approach and establishes new rules for online speech. It attempts to define one regulatory agency per country in a way that won't work. And rather than that, more regulatory agencies should be involved to ensure that we get to a meaningful and a robust understanding of what competencies are needed. There's a need when we involve those agencies for minimum standards. This has been discussed already in the keynote session at the beginning of this conference. There are some challenges with regulatory agencies in certain EU member states. I'm sure you're familiar, but we're thinking mainly much in terms of the regulators in Poland or in Hungary. And then also there's some challenges with the capacity of the regulators in terms of the DSA, the DMA, or the AI Act, where we need to ensure that there's a pool of individuals who are supporting these agencies. And this regulatory capacity pool can exist both at an EU level, but also sort of Council of Europe area in a wider context, because cross-regulatory collaboration is the key to many of the future issues that we will face in digital media and digital policy. And so if we don't ensure that media regulators are able to collaborate with data protection authorities, with competition authorities, with a wide variety of other regulators working in similar and related areas, we won't get to the kind of collaboration we need to ensure meaningful regulation of the large online platforms, which currently continues to pose considerable challenges for the context we're in right now. So I hope this contributes to the initial presentations we've heard, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, yeah, it certainly does, Ben, and you raise, I think, a lot of questions that can trigger the debate at the end of the presentation. And you make also a perfect link with the next speaker, since we now have with us a member of a regulatory authority. So we can learn from his experience, even if it's out of EU. And so I'll be happy now to give the floor to Sayed.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here, and thanks for organizers of this event. And generally, I would like to thank to our colleagues in IIC that they have provided such an interesting platform to discuss about our relevant shared issues. Actually, I'm talking a bit about our experience in Iran in the challenging perspective of regulating international social networks or video sharing platforms, or what's called giants. Actually, I wondered if our colleague moved to the next slide. Just briefly, I would like to say that Iran has a very thriving media landscape with a lot of domestic platforms, but from VODs and video sharing platforms that they are very much popular here. And I don't want to talk a bit more about them. But in the next slide, and the slide after, that's the beginning point that I'm going to talk a bit more about the role of international platforms in Iran and the challenges that we are facing with as a regulatory body. First of all, it's very clear that there is a lot of benefits of the work of international platforms in domestic markets, from accessing a wide range of user-generated content that they are not possible, they are not accessible over our own platforms or domestic platforms, and a kind of internationalization, pluralization, and so-called liberalization of domestic media landscape, and it's very very beneficial for the society. And also, I would say that they have a kind of very very interesting role as an innovation pull engine for domestic media platforms, because domestic media platforms, they are trying to protect their market share, but they need to have constantly constantly have their own innovation to have such kind of the competitive advantage to their international rivals. And also international platforms are very much interesting and attractive for local businesses because of the network effect and the economy of scale that they are representing. It's there are some statistics that more than 20% of the accounts and pages over the social networks, particularly Instagram in Iran, are kind of the business related accounts, and that means they are very much attractive because of the scale that they are representing. In the next slide, I'm trying to say a few points about the challenges that we are facing as a regulatory body. The first parts of the first category of the challenges that we are facing, I would like to call them as the challenges of media sovereignty. The most important one is that international giants are not, to some extent, responsible and accountable to domestic regulatory bodies. And there is no such accountability and transparency of their work here, and there is no official responsiveness of the international giants. It's this category is very important for us because is kind of the violating all media sovereignty. While international giants are working here, they are very much popular, but they are not going to be responsible to anyone here. The second category relates to the competition and market share and some economic issues that have been created by the work of the international giants that I'm not going to focus on because of the specific theme of this parallel session. In the next slide, I will, the third category of the challenges that we are facing with is to some extent more relevant to the theme of the session, is the media concentration. With kind of the work of the international giants, we are facing with a kind of the problem of the plurality and diversity, domestic plurality and diversity, and the lack of inclusiveness. Why? Because they are not responsible to represent our society. They are not acting, and they are not taking such a responsibility to represent different categories of our society. And the problem of inclusiveness is something that we are very much concerning with. And something that is also very important for us is some problem in prominence of the domestic content and Iranian products over the international giants. It's something that is concerning for everyone nowadays, for the European also. As far as I know, the European products and the European content is very important to be prominently accessible and easily accessible over the international platforms, and it's caused some identity and cultural concern as well. Something also is very much important for us, and maybe it's in some cases is not similar to other countries, is the problem of the what's called corporate rule and kind of the content moderation and political censorship. And it's something that we have been facing in several very severe cases in Iran, that sometimes you may have heard about some political issues that recently in last few years we have been facing with. And some international platforms like Instagram, they have suspended several thousands of Iranian accounts, and they have moderated specific contents. For example, one of the Iranian generals was killed in a battle, and the Instagram censored all the images of him over the Instagram with and thousands of the users, they have been affected by such kind of the political content moderation. And it was a very paradoxical moment for the Iranian platforms, because they have been promoting such a content, but international platforms, they have been censoring such content. And it was very iconic period of time for the media platform regulation in Iran. The next slide. In the fifth categorization, in the fifth categorization, I would like to say about some challenges of specific content and harmful contents, sometimes illegal contents. Last year, we faced very specific and iconic examples that there was a live dialogue and live kind of the streaming between a prostitute and a boy, I think in age of 13 or 14. And it was very much, was concerning for the society that even Instagram was not responsible and was not accountable for any claim of the regulatory bodies. That several authorities, they asked Instagram that to at least suspend the account of that prostitute that she tried to have a live streaming with a child. And it was a very concerning, socially and culturally concerning problem and specific examples. And the last but not least, in the next slide, I would like to talk about two other problems that we have been facing with intellectual property, because in some international platforms, particularly Telegram, is an escaping way for someone that they want to violate intellectual property of Iranian movies and TV series. And also, as I to some extent mentioned before, the challenge of sociopolitical sensitivities, like kind of the politicization of international platforms, of using their dominant power to, for example, implement unilateral sanctions over our country, is something that has been very much challenging for the regulatory body. I would like to conclude by reviewing such a benefits of using those international platforms, and my very brief review of some categories of challenges that I have tried to mention. In the last slide, I think, just as some very initial thoughts, that I would like to suggest those kind of the ideas that for international platforms to be useful for the countries, something that is very much necessary and very much needed is a kind of the constant dialogue and interactive relation between international platform and regulatory authorities of the countries. It's something that has been asked by some specific acts of different countries. In Turkey, for example, to some extent in Germany. And we also think that apart from such very strict acts, having such kind of a dialogue and interaction and regulatory relationship between international platforms and domestic authorities is very much needed and is necessary. A kind of the hotline channels to have some kind of the collaboration and cooperation in specific cases is also something that I would like to suggest for as kind of my policy implications of this kind of a very brief review. Something that is very much important is a kind of the depoliticization of international platforms. It's very, very dangerous that once some platforms are dominant and are internationally powerful, they have been used as a kind of the political weapon to silence other voices and to impose some kind of the unilateral obligations of one country against the other countries. I think depoliticization of international platform is something that is very much necessary to protect our democratic and our social cohesion. From economic point of view, that is not very much central to this session. Also, I think protecting level playing field for domestic platforms is one of the very important responsibility of the regulatory authorities that has been challenged by the work of international giants. Of course, it's everywhere. It's challenging everywhere. And something that is also culturally and socially important is to keep our domestic media platforms and content providers alive. It's something that we need some guarantee. We need some kind of the safe side for all domestic media platforms and content providers. Some kind of the responsibility and accountability of algorithm and mechanisms of international platforms. And the last but not least is kind of the local content obligations that is also needed for those platforms. From a socio-political and cultural point of view of a regulatory body, those kind
I think we're losing Sayed. Sayed, I think we are losing you. You are on and off.
And policy recommendation to share with our colleagues, and them are very much kind of countries that they are representing for this time.
Thank you very much, Sayed. We just missed the final words, but we get the whole picture. And thank you for these policy recommendations, which are very ambitious. Well, at this stage, I must confess that I think that we didn't hear that as much as we expected about positive externalities. But I'm sure that our last speaker will do his best to rebalance that. So I will be happy to give him the floor. Johan, are you there?
I'm still here, Jean-François. Merci.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would ask you to make it the shortest as you can, so we can still have some time for questions, because automatically at 5 o'clock, everyone goes back to the plenary. Thank you, Johan.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, Jean-François, so I will adjust my presentation a little bit. I'm not using slides, so I can be flexible. And I also want to incorporate a few comments on the previous speakers who have been great on this panel and also in the plenary session before. And I don't think there's a lot of rebalancing from my end, even though I represent Facebook, or Meta, as we are called right now, because I think with many of the things shared by the other speakers, I can fully agree. I will just bring in a little bit more nuance from our perspective. Maybe to start quickly, a little bit about my background. My name is Johan Ketelaar, and I'm a policy director within Meta, as we are called right now. I don't mind people still saying Facebook for the sake of easiness, or being introduced as a Facebook speaker, but we all need to get used to the new name. But I also think that the name Meta reflects the changes that the company is going through. Also on the regulatory side, in the way we are approaching regulation. And I want to make that clear also in my contribution today. I'm with Meta already 4 years, and I say already because within Meta, that means that I'm one of the all-timers. We hired a lot of people over the last 4 years, basically, after me, also because of new compliance rules, but also to anticipate upcoming regulation, but mostly also to deal with moderation of content. And I'm sure that many of you are aware of everything we have done in this regard. That said, we fully understand that there is also a huge effort by the European institutions, especially on the DSA, as others have spoken about already, and we basically support and embrace that kind of regulation. I must say, I'm an economist, and I deal more with economic regulation and connectivity regulation than with DSA in particular. But I can comment on a few things that have been said by others. And I've also been involved in a pilot that we ran a couple of years ago with the French government and the ministries about hate speech. And I was part of the then Facebook delegation, speaking closely about content moderation with those people within France who were dealing with upcoming regulation, which ended up in content rules in France, but also fed into the DSA discussion. So I think you can already see back then, which is like a couple of years ago, that we were engaging with policymakers and regulators on the issue of content moderation, and that we felt like we needed to be more transparent and open about the way we are dealing with these very complex issues. Before I joined Meta, I was a regulator myself for many years. More than 15 years, I was the head of the regulator, the director of the regulator in the Netherlands, ACM, and its predecessor, Opta, dealing with competition and telco and a bit of media regulation as well. So I've got that background, which is maybe also good to reflect a little bit on some of the other things that were said. And I know that this subject of this session is law, democracy, and institutions, and maybe for many people, the institutions part sounds maybe a little bit boring, but I will focus also a little bit on that as well, because within my former capacity, I've been working on the merger from the regulators within ACM in the Netherlands of combining different regulators into one bigger regulator, which is now ACM, dealing with competition as well as telecom markets, energy, consumer, etc. And I think that some of the things that were said before by Ben, especially the way that regulators need to work together, dealing with the issues coming from the digital markets and platforms like ourselves, is very important. And I want to just echo a little bit what Ben said in that regard. Within Meta, as I said, I work on connectivity and accessibility, which means that we are also focusing on getting everybody connected. And that means like people literally who don't have access to the internet yet, but also people who are less capable or able to deal with the internet as it is. And it means like people with visual handicaps or other handicaps. And we do a lot of efforts to make our apps accessible to those people as well. So if you translate the areas where I work on in terms of legislation, the pieces of legislation that I'm focusing on are the ECC, the Electronic Communications Code, the AVMSD, but also the European Accessibility Act. And I'm involved in the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and like I said, to some extent, the DSA. Again, in general, we at Meta embrace the whole effort by the EU. And the way the European institutions, but also the individual regulators and policymakers in the countries are involved in getting the platform regulators in place. I think key to making regulation work is to have two things at the forefront. And I think it was mentioned also by the previous speaker and before, the regulatory dialogue. I think that everybody here today listening in or speaking know that before you can come to proper regulation, you need to understand what the companies and the platforms or anybody being involved in those markets are doing actually. And I can, of course, relate to my experience as a telco regulator and the way we have done this regulatory dialogue back then with the telcos who had, as we call it, a significant market power or dominance, as you could say. And it's quite interesting. And also I was reflecting on it myself when I was preparing this conversation, how things have changed just in a couple of years, basically. Because when I was a regulator, I literally went on the bike to KPN, which was the then regulated identity, to have those regulatory conversations with them. I also hosted a lot of industry groups where everybody from the industry could participate and speak about regulation. And I think that dialogue back then, which was happening at a national scale, or in this example, at a local scale even, was key to making a regulation right. Now, we are a couple of years further down the line. And in Europe, if I may focus on Europe, then we have to deal with platforms like the one I'm representing myself, who have a global product and who are offering those products at a global or subnational scale. And the products are also like changing all the time. And now we need to think about regulation for these kind of platforms, which are also very diverse by nature. But even if you look at the DMA, for instance, and the most likely platforms to be in scope of the DMA are very diverse of nature. And then to come with that set of rules that will apply to all of them and also that will work with them is quite a challenge. And I think it's a challenge to make it right and make it work. Because you need to understand what the effects will be of the regulation. But I think it's also a challenge in practical terms. And again, Ben mentioned this in his previous conversation, because if you look at the number of people that we have working on content moderations, thousands of people are there. And if you look at the regulators dealing with digital markets or supposed to be dealing with the DSA or the DMA, you've got many regulators fragmented over the countries. And we saw the ENISA example in the cybersecurity area. But I think if you would make like similar maps dealing with digital markets like the ECC or the AVMSD, you will see like more than 100 or maybe even more than 150 potential different regulators, all knowledgeable and having some kind of enforcement responsibility in digital markets. And then coming with new proposals like the DSA and the DMA that need to work together with those existing files and those enforcing agencies is quite a challenge in itself. So I think that the regulatory dialogue between institutions and platforms like ourselves is key, but I think that the dialogue between those institutions is equally important. And of course, putting in place relative easy obligations is one thing, but to make them work, to make them, to enforce them in the first place, and without doing unnecessary harm, even for consumers, which could potentially happen, is quite a challenge too. So I think there need to be, if you look at the proposals like the DSA and the DMA, again, I think the proposals are in very good shape. It should be a combination of enforcing agencies, but also the companies being clear on their own rules when it comes to content moderation. We encourage and support the transparency requirements there. I think there's a lot that has been done already, but there's probably more that we can do ourselves also by being more transparent on the way we moderate content, for instance, the way the algorithms work. But also we need to acknowledge the fact that those things change. The algorithms, for instance, are like continuously evolving. And part of that dialogue that I was referring to need to be able to explain what the effect of potential measures would be on those kind of products that we develop.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pause here, Jean-François, because I'm conscious of the time that you want to allow for questions.
Well, yeah, we have to almost finish. Thank you, and I think it indeed answers and makes the links with some of the Sayed's insights and policy recommendations for regulatory action. Unfortunately, we just have 5 minutes left. There are no questions in the discussion panel, but I will be happy to give the floor if someone in the audience wants to raise the hand. I'm following all of you, so please feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Well, I don't see, I'm speaking under the control of the staff, but I don't see any questions. So I would use my privilege of chair to ask a question, which could be for at least for Johan, for Ben, and also for Antonio, which is related to the issue of disinformation and how you see this interaction between the AVMS directive and the DSA, and how they might work or not work together in the near future in terms of fighting against disinformation. Does one of the three of you would like to try to answer that one? Antonio, Ben, Johan?
Ben.
Antonio, go ahead.
No, I was suggesting Ben.
Okay. Okay, well.
So I was suggested, and maybe I can bring up a few things here, because I don't see a significant contribution to being able to deal with disinformation through the existing interpretations of the Digital Services Act. I think it will contribute to a certain degree to transparency and to a certain degree to accountability of online platforms. But things like disinformation are still need a lot of work. And I would add to that we recently did a study around the German elections where we looked at the degree of disinformation on Twitter and on Facebook among the German electoral content, and found that around between 6 and almost 7% of the content that you can find if you look for German electoral content is somehow either disinformation or harmful, or in some cases even illegal. But the majority of problematic content is not illegal content, it's legal content. And so in all of these debates in the DSA or elsewhere, when we get really riled up about the illegal stuff, most disinformation, almost all disinformation, almost all really problematic content for societies is legal content. And so we really need to develop better regimes and better mechanisms and better processes for both defining what disinformation is and also how we respond to it systematically. Because right now we don't have the tools and techniques in place to be able to do that. And we are very dependent on the large platforms to do this. And that dependency is not healthy in a democratic society, particularly since the previous research papers we did on disinformation on those large platforms and those metrics showed that, and it's been documented recently, not just by our research, but by many other colleagues as well and whistleblowers, that the metrics that are provided in transparency on disinformation and on many other categories by the large online platforms, including Facebook, including many of the other ones as well, are either false or incorrect or manipulative. So we're not in a very good situation in terms of where disinformation stands right now, and we need to do a lot of work to improve that.
Okay, unfortunately, it will be the final word. And well, anyway, I don't see any other hand raised. So it's 5 p.m. now, and we are all going to go back to the plenary. And I don't know how it works, so maybe someone from the IIC, Melanie, could give us the instructions, or how is it going to happen?
Hi there. You can either just click leave the room and you'll go back in, and then bring them back into the other room, or else they'll do it automatically. But yeah, you can leave the room and then come back into the other room.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our 5 panelists, and well, see you in a few moments at the plenary. Bye-bye.